Between the reeds I saw their bodies gleam, who cool no mortal fever in the stream, crying to the woods the rage of their desire, and their bright hair went down in jeweled fire, where crystal broke and dazzled shudderingly, where roses drink the sun's scent and our light play, amid tumbled flowers shall match the death of day.
The flute of Debussy's Faun is like a kind of magic carpet taking us to new lands. Just as the French Impressionist painters had given the world a new image of colour, shape and texture, just as Mallarmé's poems had used words for their sound and their shape as much as their meaning, so Debussy moves us into a world where light and flexibility is everything. Whereas so much German and Austrian music had been to do with finding order and form and rules, Debussy was searching for a music and an art without feet. So, texture became important, moment for moment. Form was a matter of what was heard. And above all, we were looking at a sense of colour. There's a danger when we talk about Impressionism of all kinds, that we think of something without bones, without muscles, entirely without form. Turner's paintings, which for me are in a way the soul of Impressionism, take a moment of light miraculously and distill it. But in doing that, he's using thousands of little constituent parts with enormous calculation, enormous care, which gives it unity. It's not only music that's reinvented, it's the whole palette of the orchestra. And if the palette of the Austrian and German composers was like a dark oil painting, here we're talking watercolour, or perhaps some kind of painting not yet invented. L'après-midi is so well known now, it's so much an icon of music and art that we tend to forget how new it sounded when it was written. Indeed, people at first thought they were hearing the orchestra tune up. The horns, which were so much a part of the German fixation with hunting and forests, are no longer a blanket which covers. They're somehow a sound which warms and heats and gives us reds and oranges rather than browns. The woodwinds are allowed to do different things. They tend to make shapes which aren't decoration, because in this, decoration becomes substance. The strings become some kind of wash of background, rather like in a watercolour. Very detailed, but not always clear to the ear or eye. The use of little flecks of colour, the use of harps, which don't impinge themselves on your consciousness. All this is completely new. The idea that colour could be a form in itself must have seemed, at the very least, slightly sinful, and at the worst, desperately revolutionary. And indeed, there was revolution going on in Paris in the early 1900s, where many of the world's most talented painters, poets, writers, dancers and musicians had congregated. The boundaries between the arts were becoming more and more blurred, and the dark colours of the 19th century were being crowded out by the rainbows of a new age. One of the absolutely vital figures in the arts around the beginning of the 20th century was not an artist, was not a musician. Indeed, he was a man who said, "My singular talent is that I have no talents." Diaghilev was a great impresario, a great visionary, if not a great thinker, a man of astonishing instincts. Although he had started off as a concert promoter, his main claim to fame is as the manager of the Ballet Russe. Diaghilev managed to persuade the cream of dancers, choreographers, artists and musicians to work together. What he did was to find the firebrands. And at the time, there could have been no greater risk than taking the then 26-year-old Stravinsky and asking him to create a ballet which would last an hour. If there's anyone who one has to say is the sound of the 20th century, it's Stravinsky. One of the most striking things about the Firebird is its youthfulness and energy. There are all the devices of exoticism, Orientalism, of Russian church sounds, of folk music. It's here because it is full of colour. But my God, what carnivorous colours these are. It is not a matter of pale washes. It's not a matter of light diffusing. It's a matter, as always with Stravinsky, of going straight for the jugular. This is rapacious music. It's dangerous music. And although he unashamedly stole some of it from his teacher, Rimsky-Korsakov, even the very notes, it becomes something else. The colours are brilliant and primary. What they have is an unparalleled type of savage glitter. Firebird is an old Russian fairy tale, a classic confrontation between good and evil. To defeat the ogre Kasche, Prince Ivan summons up a bird of fire, whose golden feathers light up the night sky. A world away from the savagery of Stravinsky is the music of Maurice Ravel, and it's a measure of Diaghilev's insight that he could take these two great composers and give them their head. He was a man fascinated not only by ancient Greek, Roman, Chinese cultures, but preferably those cultures as refracted through France. Daphnis and Chloe, written just 2 years after The Firebird, must be the most sensuous ballet ever written. If we look at the score in the famous passage where he describes dawn, what one can see is an almost limitless fluttering, an activity built up of so many tiny little pieces that they are almost like grains of sand. What one hears, of course, is the entire beach. For Ravel, the mechanics of writing a piece were often as important as the piece itself. He was a man fascinated by the small, fascinated by mechanical objects, and in fact, famously, he was seen looking at a mechanical bird and saying, "I can hear its heart beating." For Ravel, mere reality had none of the power of pure imagination. Some friends tell a story of him wandering through their house saying, "Oh, but it's wonderful, it's a fake Greek vase. This is fantastic, this is a fake painting." As if the whole idea of something that wasn't quite real was going to be more interesting than the heart of the thing itself. He's one of the first composers to really use the actual sounds of birdsong. And in this, he's looking forward to Messiaen. But in the gigantic sweep and passion which goes underneath all this detail, he's looking back to Mahler. And it's a very strange and unusual synthesis. Knowing how long all this music took Ravel to write, it is unbelievable just how natural the progression is, how the whole piece seems to convey one great sunrise. Listening to it, one's simply stunned by this dazzling, blinding sense of colour mounting and then breaking like some huge wave. Debussy wrote Je to a commission from Diaghilev. But the ballet was a catastrophe. And it's very interesting that in all the years since it was written, it has never really been successful as a ballet at all. What Debussy was doing was writing music which reflected the state of the cinema. All the contemporary ideas of split screen, of coming in and out of focus, of one image dissolving into another, all these things would have delighted Debussy, and he would have seen that he had blood brothers over the century. The word je applies to the plot, which has to take the prize for the flimsiest ballet plot ever invented, to do with a boy losing a tennis ball, searching for it, finding two women, going in and out of bushes with them, and then going back to playing tennis. But in truth, this music is too subtle for any ballet. You have to realize, at a time that was used to music having some kind of solidity, Debussy's ideal of the orchestra and music without feet had gone into a new area. It's not music without a form, but it's not any form as any composer before would ever have defined it. He was inventing a kind of music that was always in motion. So in fact, this piece is just one long transition. The piece is full of Debussy's trademark arabesques, themes which seem to curlicue round themselves. But one keeps on getting little sniffs of something else, of little waltzes, of little marches, smells of a breeze, and one has to learn simply to give oneself in to this type of strange, cinematic, dreamlike logic. This music is spectral, evanescent, a peripheral vision glimpsed from the corner of an eye. People were saying, how can music constantly be going somewhere without arriving? Now, there is a saying which says, it's better to journey than to arrive. Debussy is saying, you must never consent to arrive. Debussy was making a melody out of colours. Although the actual notes are important, how they're dressed, what shape they make, what shadows they cast, is as important as the sheer fact of the notes themselves. Now, in case this seems to be an entirely French story, we must move slightly sideways to Schoenberg, who was always searching for new modes of language. Schoenberg was an amateur painter, but a very good amateur painter. And a lot of his images have all the claustrophobic power of his best music. But of course, paints on canvas can slide into each other in a way that orchestral colours can't always. And maybe he was looking for the type of ideal instrument that would be able to provide him with these colours. In the third movement of his 5 orchestral pieces, he was trying in some ways to prove a point, that it would be possible to absolutely mirror the technique of painting in music, and that one could have a single chord which would develop not by changing its note, but by changing its orchestration, so that one somehow pulsed in and out of the sound. He wants to paint the picture of a still day on a lake. And orchestrally, he's giving us a picture of the water and the type of eerie stillness. Occasional fish dart to the surface, but the most important thing is the pulsing. And it has a type of hypnotic quality of no other music, as though for once Schoenberg, that most hyperactive of all intellects, had found really a still centre. The year is 1945. We're in Messiaen's composition class in Paris, and this is the first notation for piano by his 21-year-old student, Pierre Boulez. Boulez has spent a large part of his life repolishing, changing, adapting pieces. And in a way, his most touching tribute to his younger self is what he's done with 4 of these 12 piano notations. When he wrote these piano pieces, he was not only under the sway of Messiaen, his teacher, but had realized that the music of the Austrian composer Anton Webern, with all its simplicity, economy, and crystalline perfection, was going to be the way forward for him. And what he's done more than 40 years later is to not only expand the piece, but expand its possibilities. The orchestral version is the work of a man who has changed, who has become much more mellow, much more humorous, and much more all-inclusive of the world. The great teacher, Nadia Boulanger, said the first thing she noticed about Boulez when she met him, and which was very scary, was the fact that if you played the note G, you would not only hear the note G, but you would hear the whole harmonic series around it. He would hear all the possibilities of the note. If you hear the first 2 bars in the piano notation, you can hear not only what he's done with the orchestra to these bars, but how he's expanded it backwards, as though it didn't start with this note, but it started with another note in the harmonic series, which is this. So the piece is stretched and expanded in every direction. Now, Boulez has written for not only a gigantic orchestra, it's an orchestra which is well over 100 soloists. Every single string player has his own part. When asked recently by a string player, why do we have all these parts where surely they can't all be heard? We've rehearsed them for hours, we've practiced them for days. Why have you written them if they can't be heard? And Boulez answered, it's not that. It's just that if you see a tree, you don't see each individual leaf, but you can certainly see if the leaves aren't there. And I need all of you playing. I need all of the leaves. It's a magnificent playground of sonorities. Charming, alive, and for me, a kind of scurrying of thousands of small animals. Now, if it is Boulez's immensely sensitive ear which strikes one, it is Messiaen's sense of colour that is most important in all of his music. Messiaen is an absolutely central figure for the 20th century, not only because he's a great composer, but also because he was a great teacher and spreader of the word, a man of such generosity that when his young pupil, Pierre Boulez, called his Tarangolila Symphony brothel music, he was still willing to teach him. Maybe he felt complimented. He had the gift of synesthesia, which means that when he heard chords, he would also see colours. Andrei Previn tells a wonderful story about the confusion of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra brass section when rehearsing Tarangolila Symphony. Asking Messiaen if he wanted it played any differently, he simply said, "Yes, would you play it a little more greeny orange?"
La première fois que je suis venu à la Sainte-Chapelle, j'étais un tout petit garçon, je devais avoir 11 ans, et ça a été pour moi un émerveillement de couleurs, et je crois que c'est à ce moment-là que j'ai compris que la musique était colorée. Quand vous voyez un vitrail, vous ne voyez pas tout de suite tous les personnages. Vous avez une sensation colorée et vous êtes ébloui. Vous êtes obligé de fermer les yeux. Mais la chose merveilleuse, c'est que les personnages que vous voyez ont des rouges, des verts, des jaunes, toutes sortes de couleurs. Lorsque j'entends un accord, un complexe de son, je vois, pas par les yeux, mais intérieurement, dans ma tête, des couleurs correspondantes. Je vais vous le jouer maintenant en accord parallèle et ça va donner un bleu-violet avec des petits cubes gris, un peu de bleu de cobalt, un peu de bleu de Prusse, quelques reflets violacés, or, rouge et rubis et quelques étoiles mauves, noires et blanches. Mais la dominante, c'est le bleu-violet. Le voilà.
In his lifelong search for material, one of the most constant points of return for him was birdsong. He took birdsong and made it a structural part of his pieces. Now, birds to him are not only sheer sounds of nature, they are sounds reflecting the glories of a God who he felt was in everything. In 1963, he wrote one of his great masterpieces, Et Expecto Resurrectionem Mortuorum, which is for winds and metal percussion instruments. And in the middle of this movement, he gives us a vision of the song of the Calandra lark. This is not just a transcription, it's a colorization of the whole idea of birdsong. Messiaen travelled widely in the East and collected all different types of musics. For instance, his use of gongs comes very much from his interest in Indonesian gamelan, but also from his vision of gongs as sacred, magical, almost dangerous instruments. When you hit a gong, you hear not only the one deep sound, but again many different notes of the harmonic series. He uses Indian rhythms to give a sense of asymmetry, but also he builds up his pieces almost like Balinese landscapes, so that there are many different things, one on top of each other. And it trips along with the kind of almost hysterical good humour of a type of celestial jazz band. talking about colour in the 20th century from this vantage point, it's completely apt that we finish with the music of Toru Takemitsu. What he took were all of Debussy's revolutionary ideas, but looked at them through a totally Japanese sensibility. And when he was not writing for the concert hall or for chamber music, he was writing for the theatre and particularly for films, and being inspired by the idea of films. So many of the things which we would take for granted, Takemitsu saw for the first time in films. Just to give one example, the idea of a curtain gently flapping in the wind was something he saw in a film. In a country where curtains don't exist, it's hardly surprising, but it's still a jolt of the imagination for us.
だから、外国に行って全く言葉が分かんなくても僕はすぐ外国に行くと映画館の中に入ってより現実生活とそれから彼らの内部とそれから外の時間とかね生活感覚とかね言葉なんか分かんなくてもねイメージをこう見てるとね分かるんですね。非常に音楽的に分かってくるっていうか。
Everything we've said about Debussy's idea of taking each sound for itself, going to the next one, comes together with Takemitsu's Eastern sense, where he says that for him, writing a piece of music is like walking through a beautiful Japanese garden.
日本の庭園っていうのは大体こういうふうに見ていくんですね。回遊回ってくる。それはもうそのリニアなものに対しては全然違う円環的なこう輪廻っていうかもう一回また戻ってくると。だから僕は音楽でいろんな音楽的なオブジェっていうか。
The piece we're playing is called Dream Window. He makes wonderful titles, but this title seems to be particularly personal to him. It's as though he's opening a whole new window onto not only the Western, but the Eastern world, making a synthesis of these two worlds in a way that is peculiarly him, but is also particularly contemporary. Now, an enormous amount of the colour in French music has been to do with the spacing of chords, with the fact that the notes aren't cluttered up. There is space for the colour to get through the notes. Now, in Takemitsu's music, this has reached another stage entirely. The chords are so wide that they seem to be taking in the entire world. And this is an appropriate metaphor for a Japanese person who has found out about the West through films, but who has looked back at Japan through yet another mirror, yet another window.